I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. So today we're going to talk about finishing the race, because not everybody finishes the race well. It's easy to get distracted, okay? And I'm the guy that does your funeral, okay? And, and for the right honorarium, I can keep out all the bad stuff you did, okay? And only mention the good things. That was a joke, but it's interesting. We've had a number of funerals lately. I think we've had 5 funerals in 7 months, and we could go 7 years without a funeral around here. So funerals are not a normal experience for us. Judy was a radical spiritual woman of God. I thought she was the perfect balance between Martha and Mary. She sought the Lord like Mary and served the Lord like Martha. Just wonderful. There was another person, if they were a believer, they were going to be saved purely by the grace of Jesus, because they cultivated no relationship with God whatsoever. Then I had another funeral where this guy never got it together. Till his last day, though he was a Christian, he, was still acting like a non-Christian. Because he believed, I'm quite certain he went to heaven, but the awkwardness of never getting it right with God, I don't think that that's the way we're supposed to exit the world. I remember burying this one family member. This is back in the day, and he was a high roller, charismatic personality. He could light up the room with his sense of humor. He ran a $1 billion budget for his job. He enjoyed boats and travel and all the good things in life. And at the funeral, the preacher said his was a life well lived. And I remember thinking, well, he definitely enjoyed the good life, but maybe he got saved at the end of his life. His wife was a Christian. I can tell you this, after knowing him for 25 years, Pastor William never had a spiritual conversation with him, never saw any manifestation of the things of God. I believe he did usher at the church that his wife went to. I don't know what charities he participated in, what offerings he put into the plate. I know that if his wife said, we're going to do this, that's what he did. But a life well lived, in whose opinion? Okay? And sometimes we forget God's opinion carries a little more weight than anybody else's. All right? And you and I are involved in the good fight. We're supposed to be. Fight the good fight. It's a battle between good and evil. And what's wild is Paul's writing this statement while he is in a prison holding situation. Okay? His freedom has been taken from him. And does he wallow in self-pity? No. By the way, it's 2 Timothy 4:7, if you were looking for the Bible verse. He's just, I'm suffering, Jesus suffered, I'm supposed to follow Jesus' lead, and so that's where he's at. His church, the churches that he's placed all over, are being ransacked by bad doctrine. His ministry partners have fallen off, and then he remembers they're not his churches, they're God's churches. And it's such a freedom as a pastor to remember that this place is his place, I'm not the guy whose name is on the marquee. Jesus, it's his church. And so when you remember he's the boss, he's the source, he's in charge, he's the one who makes things happen, it's really not about my ability or inability. It's about my connecting to him to make sure that Jesus has access to the pulpit, to the programs, to the pastoring, to the counseling, to every angle of ministry, okay? It's about him. And these could be among Paul's last words in the Bible, all right? He is exiting the world, and notice how he exits, encouraging others in their faith. So important that you hear this. I'll never forget, I was at the bedside of one person in Nebraska, and she was hours away from moving to the next realm, and she said to her husband, "If only you wouldn't have sold that Berkshire Hathaway stock, we would have had $60 million, And I don't know that bringing up mistakes and failures and money is probably not the best conversation as you're entering into the presence of God. But, that's the conversation. And I think when we're exiting this world, it's a good time for us to reflect on the next world. And by the way, I'll never forget, everybody's talking about, is this the end times? Is this not the end times? Could this be the end times? Is this the beginning of the end times? Are we already in the end times? There's all kinds of conversations going on. And I remember one time this guy laid out this elaborate, detailed description of, that the sun will be in the constellation of Virgo, and the moon will be near Virgo's feet, and Venus and Mars and Mercury will be above Virgo in the constellation of Leo, and the planet Jupiter will move out of Virgo. And this is all laid out in Revelations 12. Everything I just said in the constellation is laid out in Revelations 12. And, the woman is who gets pregnant and gives birth to a male child is going to rule the nations, and Virgo is who she is, and Jupiter is who the child is, and all this means the end times are happening on September 23rd. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty intense. Now, so he had his theology down. It turned out to be wrong. But this guy had no ministry happening in his life. No joyful conversations about Jesus. No. Nothing that Jesus would say is the way I want you to live. He was just a theology hunter looking for the end times. Okay? So to be that close to the Word of God and miss what it was about is something that I think happens a lot. You could be teaching the Bible and explaining all the things that it means, but not be in that close relationship with God. Remember he's in Matthew 7, did we not, do all these miracles and radical things? And Jesus says, I never knew you. It's not about knowing stuff. It's about knowing him, being in that relationship with him. And so as we think about Christ's return, when is the end times? I don't know when the end times are going to be, but I know that all of us have an end time date. And so maybe we ought to think about that date first before we worry about the end time date. Okay? And here's the truth of the matter. We only get an allotment of time on earth, and then it's time for eternity. This is your moment, right here, right now. And, for some of us, our moment, we have fewer days till that moment happens than we've already lived. Okay? But we don't know. Some people, they're health nuts. I'm one of those guys. I eat healthy. I work out. I try to keep myself an amazing frame of being so that I can live as long as I can. And then I'll meet somebody who's a complete and total health nut, in better shape than me, better nutrition than me, better sleep patterns than me, no stress, and then they die. And you're like, wait a minute, you're not supposed to die. Okay. I went to see somebody in the hospital the other day, and they had this wrong with them, and that wrong with them, and the other thing wrong with them, and all those things were bad. And they go, but for the most part, I feel pretty good. I'm like, okay, no. We better have the end time conversation for you. And I like Paul. He uses imagery of athletics, like a race. Run the race before you. I don't know if I told you before about the two gas company servicemen. One was a supervisor and the other was a young trainee, and they were checking on gas meters, and they get to the end of the alley, and this woman's watching them, the gas man, come and check the meters, and then all of a sudden the older one says to the younger one, I'll race you back to the truck. So, the gas men take off, and they get to the truck and turn around, and this woman was huffing and puffing behind him. And, ma'am, what's going on? She goes, I don't know, but when I saw two people, gas men, running down the alley, I figured I'd better follow them, And the fact of the matter is, this lady was running, but she didn't know why. But she was convinced that her life depended on it. All right? And I think that if you and I ran our race, our Christian life with fervency, okay, that souls are on the line, that people's relationship with God are up for grabs, that would be better than, hey, I got saved, I'm good, everything's fine for me. Christianity is about me taking God's gifts and sharing them with other people. That's what he wants. That's how we live. We don't just get our gift. Remember, we talked about that with Esther. She doesn't get to be queen and say, well, good luck, everybody else. No, she's the queen, and she has an opportunity to save God's people. And you and I have an opportunity to save God's people as well. Okay? And I want you to think about this. So, when we're called to run the race, I think it's a steady determination that involves everything within you. I don't want you to have a compartmentalized life where I've got my social life and I got my family life and I have my work life and I have my church life and I have my personal life. No. God invades all parts of your life. And your personal life, he cares about what you think about. He cares about how you interact in your social life. He cares about the attitude you bring to the church. He cares about the way you spend your money. He cares about everything in your life. And what he does is he comes into it and makes it magical, makes it incredible. Extending forgiveness or receiving forgiveness. What a powerful experience either one of those are. Watching people's lives get changed and you got to contribute to it. What an incredible opportunity that is, okay? And so I think that the fact of the matter is it's easy to stop running, okay? It's easy to complain about the conditions of the race. And a lot of people, they get mad. I don't understand why God does this. I don't understand why God does that. How come he allows, and we come up with, earthquakes and child abuse and, people starving to death. And we used to ask that question knowing, we're saying, hey, God, you're the great judge. We don't understand what you're doing. But now we ask the question as if we're the judge looking down at him saying, you better give an account of yourself, God. And I actually have had people say that to me. When I get to heaven, he's going to have to give an account. And I'm like, oh my. I think it might be a little different than that if you get to heaven. Okay. And I think there's going to be more people in heaven. I really believe God. And I got a good friend. And he goes around determining who's not going to be there. And I have bad news. Most of you won't make it according to his standards. Okay? Just wanted to let you know that.
Sounds like he won't.
Well, you know what's funny is I think he's going to make it and he's going to realize, wow, I was an idiot. I had no idea about the grace of God. We can get so locked into the letter of the law that we don't see the spirit of the law and the heart of God and the grace that is just lavished upon all of us. Okay? And, I think that, yeah, sometimes the ways of God, we don't understand him. But when you and I choose to trust him anyways, this is so important. When you and I choose to believe, even though it doesn't make sense, even though you and I trust him when that's not what the circumstances indicate, we end up experiencing the answers to the questions that people are asking or that are doubts in your own heart. Okay? So deciding, I don't know, I don't like it, but I believe in God. I know that, I know there's evil in the world. That's what Adam and Eve brought into the world. And I know Jesus has the final word against evil, and we're still working out that battle here. And, since we're working out that battle here, let me fight the good fight rather than pull back and do the Monday morning quarterback. Well, if I was God, I would have done it this way. If I was God, I would have done it that way. Okay? Well, you walk with God, so let him lead you to the places where he's going to do something in you and through you and around you. Well, let's see. I think some of us were not in the race because we're out of shape spiritually. All right? Nobody here, but lots of Christians never read their Bibles. Okay? Lots of Christians have no dedicated prayer life. There's 100 million Christians who don't go to church. I ran into a guy yesterday that his theology is so tight that there is no church that is good enough for him, so he doesn't go to church. And I just want you to know there's nowhere in the Bible that would okay that. And I didn't bother arguing with him, But I thought it was sad that this person who loves Jesus so intensely has removed himself from being an avenue of God's grace to others. But you know what? It's not really God's grace. He's got things so tightly wound up that if you don't agree correctly with this particular perspective, you're out. And these people who are deciding who's in or out, in Romans 14:4 it says, who are you to judge the servant of another? Okay? Because to his master he will stand or fall, and stand he will, because the grace of God will make sure, even when we're weak, we get to stand. And Paul, you know what? He stays in spiritual shape. He stays in the Word. He stays in the presence of God, i.e. his prayer life. He stays in the belief of God, i.e. when he prays, he expects something to happen. Now remember, one of his teammates got sick, and Paul didn't lay hands on him, and he got healed. Didn't you kind of feel like Paul would heal everybody? Didn't happen that way. There were people on his team that he said, God, would you do something here? I'm sure he first laid hands on them. Okay. So you get to see that God does what he's going to do, and you and I have to just be comfortable letting him be God. And when Paul says, I've kept the faith and I've finished the course, finishing well, it's not an easy accomplishment. One time I got this book, God's Generals, and it's about all these guys who do amazing ministries, and they all ended poorly. They ended up not finished doing ministry. They ended up not believing. They ended up, falling into sinful habits or doubt, and you go, what happened? Here's what happened. Common theme, they isolated themselves from others. There's a place where I'm pastor and you're not. And therefore, call my assistant and they'll see if they can set you up with one of my associate pastors. And so they create a distance, and then they separate themselves from the body of Jesus Christ, and they now are vulnerable because I need you. I require your spiritual input, your prayers, your participation, your correction. All of us together are trying to help each other in terms of be the body of Jesus Christ. And when you isolate yourself, guess what happens? Okay? You don't end up ending well. And I know lots of Christians don't. I talked about it on Sunday. I went up to one guy and said, hey man, you used to be a man of God. What happened to you? And he didn't get offended. He's like, yeah, I'm not where I need to be. And he thanked me for speaking to him that way. I've said that to other people, and the conversation did not go well. Okay? So really, it's about your state of heart. Are you someone that Jesus can use another person to speak to, or are you above it all? Okay? Well, we're called to inspire one another. And it's kind of interesting. When you read the Bible, we see the past saints and their walks with God. And we remember Noah, who built the ark. It took him 120 years to do it. Okay? Maybe you haven't had an answered prayer yet. Have you put 120 years into that prayer? Okay. I want you to know something. If you've been praying for somebody all of your days and it hasn't happened yet, I can guarantee you that God will answer your prayer even after you die. So, he promises to answer prayers, and if he decides to do it after you left, or if he decides to do it on the other side, I know that he promises to answer prayers. And what does that mean? We know he's a good God. We know that he answers prayers. And if he decides to do something different than what your agenda was, he'll have a good reason for not doing it. But he's a God who's gracious and full of mercy and compassion and loving kindness. Okay? And so I think you should not grow weary. And it's good for us to remember Noah, and Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David. Some of these guys did not end well. David, he said, hey, make sure you kill this guy, kill that guy, and kill that other guy. In real time, he said, show him grace. But when he died, he's like, hey, remember that guy was mean to me? Get him. Okay, like, David, wait a minute. Don't go that way. Samson, okay, didn't end so well. I mean, he did push the pillars down and kill more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. Moses, he got mad. And God said, because you treated me as unholy in front of the people, you don't get to go into the promised land. What are you starting to see here? Okay? It's easy to not end well. And so, the radical thing about God is you can blow it and still stay in the race. You can make mistakes, and he never stops working through you. And I want you to hear that, because it's I think once you know the gracious hand of God has your life, wow. Okay. I'm accountable to him. His hand is full of grace. And what it usually does is say, let me step into ending well rather than dying with bitterness or living in unforgiveness or living selfishly or separating myself from the church because, they offended me. Hey, hold on. Just think about it from God's perspective. How is he going to deal with any of that? He's going to go, come on, are you kidding me? All that grace I showed you, and this is how you're acting? Okay. See how kind he is even when we're messing up? He's so patient. And I think all of us have someone on earth who's impacted our lives, and you're supposed to then turn around and be a catalyst. What blows my mind is when you run into Christians like, this one person who's dying of leukemia and calls me up and says, "Hey, Pastor, how can I support you right now?" I'm like, "Well, I'm praying for you." "Oh, I know, but I can still pray and ask God's hand to move. How can I support you?" I'm like, "Wow, that's kind of cool." People who are in dire, life-threatening situations, it doesn't dissuade them from still trying to. I'll never forget one woman. She was dying, and it was the stewardship campaign, and she stepped up and put money. She put her pledge card in, and I'm thinking, well, you don't have to put a pledge card in, but she did, because it was between her and God. She wasn't trying to impress anybody. She wasn't trying to buy more time. This is how she lived, and she was going to die the way she lived, supporting the Church of Jesus Christ. Okay? And in Hebrews 12:1, it says, lay aside every encumbrance and the sin that entangles us so that we can run the race before us. And a lot of times, running the race requires training. I'll never forget, I ran into a guy who ran a 100-mile race. I didn't even know there was races that long. 100 miles. I said, "Do you need a foot rub?" He goes, "The back of my knees are killing me." So, interesting, huh? But the ongoing action, the continual exercise of removing our baggage. Does anybody here have baggage? Okay? Those emotional baggage, the scars from the past, the bad habits that, used to be bad habits and now they're just part of our character. I think you got to go, wait a minute. I got one person in my life, they swear more than Scarface does. Hopefully you don't know who Scarface is. It's a bad movie, don't watch it. But I'm like, okay, I don't think you're supposed to swear that much at all. Okay? And that's just who I am. Well, no, that's something you need to surrender to the Lord, right? I got this bad habit. I like it that, people still in their 60s, 70s, and 80s still fighting off their lifelong entanglement. Remember that one 90-year-old cellist? They said, why are you still practicing? He goes, I think I'm getting better. Okay? Still at it. And I think you and I are supposed to still be at it. Still have a prayer life. Still be reading the scriptures. Still be trying to surrender whatever it needs to, whatever saps our strength. And I think practicing forgiveness and investing in people and being patient with others. These are the kind of attitudes that they can get in the way. Remember when Alexander the Great, he's advancing towards Persia, and this is a critical point. They're going to take on the power of the world, and they have collected so much plunder that they were no longer effective. And so Alexander said, hey, everybody put your plunder into the pile here, and he burned it, and everybody was so angry. They got all this gold and all these trinkets and all this expensive stuff that they were lugging around, and once they got rid of all the baggage, they were ready to take over the Persian kingdom. But when you got your baggage, you're not going to fight the good fight. And I think sometimes you and I were holding on to things. I got a text today from somebody, hey, this is going on. And I said, I said, be willing to make the difficult choice, because that will free you. And sometimes being willing to say, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and forgive. Okay, I'm just not going to let this bother me. Okay, I'm just going to trust God. Okay, I'm not going to make God to explain himself to me. That frees you up now to, as one commander wrote, it was as if wings had been given to them and they walked lightly again and victory was assured. Your victory will be assured with Christ if you're not carrying all your emotional baggage. Okay? And this is between you and God, where jealousy or a critical spirit or hatred or lust or greed or pride can interfere with your walk with God. And everybody, you know what your sin is. That's called the besetting sin. That one sin that you had in junior high, and how is it that it's still with me 50 years later? And have you ever noticed when you do get rid of one sin, another one pops up? You're like, wait a minute. I thought I just conquered my sin. You know? I conquered this in my life, and all of a sudden now I have a problem with pride. Hey, I conquered that. Okay? And you haven't. You know, and you're like, wow, there's a new sin, pride. And I think what happens is you're going to constantly be in this surrendering mode, or Satan's never going to stop trying to roll marbles under your feet. And so you live in this constant enjoyment of your walk with God while you surrender yet another piece of yourself. Okay? Well, the way to do it is to fix your eyes on Jesus. Concentrate your gaze. You know, and that means looking away from other things. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of this world will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. But that would make a good hymn, wouldn't it?
It is a good hymn.
Oh, it is a good hymn. Okay. I knew it came from somewhere. You know, Demas, he's this guy, Paul says, my faithful servant Demas. First time you're introduced to him. Then the next time it's just Demas. And then the third time it's Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me. And you see that walking with the Lord, stagnant in the Lord, no longer walking with the Lord. And I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people like that. Okay? And when I feel myself getting into that stagnant spot, I fight hard. I have to change my rhythm, get up early, rearrange my calendar, make sure that I'm pursuing the Lord so that because what happens is you get stagnant and then you get comfortable there, then you start to get callous towards spiritual things, and the next thing you know, you don't even bother going to church anymore. So when you find yourself in that spot, that's when you go to the presence of God and say, hey, help me out here. I don't want to drift. Okay? I'm just telling you how I've had to do it. And you know, people, they say it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10:31, okay? And you know, you and I, we don't have to worry about falling into the hands of the living God, because the cross of Jesus Christ covers us. But I wonder if how much of our energy we wasted by not keeping that fear of falling into the hands of the living God for other people. Okay? Maybe you and I are comfortable, but other people, they have to deal with falling into the hands of the living God. And you know, remember I talked about this one relative of mine, never had a spiritual conversation with him in 25 years? That guy was a loser, right? Well, wait a minute. William, how come you didn't insist on having a conversation with that guy in 25 years? Now, to be honest, you know, he would sidestep it. He would, you know, avoid that conversation. He never wanted to initiate or engage. So I will say that there was a lot of sidestepping and dodging. But there is that moment when, hey, can I just have this one conversation with you? You know, when somebody's in your life and in your family and part of your world, I think it's okay for you and me to say, this is part of fighting the good fight. This is part of finishing the race well. Helping them with their race as well as part of your race. All right? I'm almost done. Put up with me for another 5, okay? And I think sometimes it comes down to that encounter that you have with God. When you come to church, you're inviting God to have an encounter with you. I think when you come to Bible study, you're inviting the Lord to move into your head. I think when you have your devotional life, you're creating a space to have a relationship with God. And I don't know about you, but sometimes in that space, there's this moment where, Lord, I got this thing. I'd rather not hand it over to you, but I have a feeling it's between us, and I guess I have to get real with you here. I've held on to this negative thought for decades, or I haven't surrendered this bad attitude forever, or I am afraid of, following what you're asking me to do. There's this moment when you and I have to get real vulnerable with the Lord. And that's the beauty of your devotional life. You can cover it with an easy Bible read and, a common prayer. But it's also that place where you can put that common prayer aside and say, Lord, woe is me. Lord, what do you want from me? And that's the beauty of your devotional life. It's where you get real with God. Well, let me say a couple more things and we'll be done. Somebody will often say at a funeral, he died a good death. And well, what does that even mean? Okay? And a lot of people don't die well. They die in anger, they die in confusion, they die in bitterness, they die in fear. They die with an attitude towards somebody on the way out. I'll never forget this one guy. He was dying. They were going to give him the shot to send him off to eternity. Okay? And so the nurse is a young nurse, and I don't know that she's ever given somebody the death shot. And so she's shaking. I'm standing right there. And she's trying to find the vein, and she misses, and he looks up at her and says, what are you doing, practicing? And I'm like, probably not the best attitude to have. The best way to go to the other side, And what's happening in that moment should be so sacred. Should be so focused on, I'm about to enter the presence of God. Okay? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, unless you integrate Jesus into your mind, you're not going to end well. And there's the crux. If you're here, you're not going to end well. And why wait for that last moment? Why not just start while you got 10, 20, 30 more years left? Practicing, living well, and watching God move through you. Okay? Well, I remember this one elementary school boy would go over to his friend's house every day, and at his friend's house, his grandma was always reading the Bible. Always. Every time he went to his friend's house, always reading the Bible. And so he says, why is your grandma always reading the Bible? And the little boy said, well, I think she's cramming for her finals. Okay? Right? But I think there comes a moment when you're no longer reading about your Christianity and everything is personal off the page. I run into people who want to talk to me about the historical events in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and you're like, no. Well, let's see the God that's moving to Elijah in 1 Kings and the relationship that's being developed there. Slow down and put yourself into that situation, okay, and experience it. Last thing I want to say, everybody dies except for Enoch and Elijah, okay? And let's just focus in on Enoch. it says he walked with God and then was no more because God took him. All right? I believe he was 360 years old, something like that. And Enoch had such an incredible relationship with God that God just said, why don't you come home with me rather than go home to your own place? Okay? That is the theological teaching of what happened to Enoch. And where did Enoch develop this close relationship with God? Well, if you do the math, Adam, who lived for 622 years during Enoch's life, was part of Enoch's family, was the patriarch of all people. He probably would have talked with Enoch about what it was like walking with God in the garden. And what it was like to have that personal friendship in the cool of the afternoon in the Garden of Eden. Okay? And that deep personal connection. And then Enoch would have witnessed the death of Adam. Realize this would be the first death that ever happened. All right? There is no death before this moment. And I was like, whoa. Well, I guess there was Cain killed Abel, right? So there goes that argument. But I think that people were trying to like, okay, this is Adam, the father of humanity. And I'm pretty sure that Adam told Enoch about God making a garment for him and Eve when they got kicked out of the garden, and how he cared for them, and how he still provided for them, and how he still loved them. And remember, Cain and Abel presented their gifts to God. So that means everybody still pursued God. And, I don't know where you take an offering. Is it not in worship? They're worshiping God. They're having the same relationship that you can have when you come to church with God. So, I think the goal for you and me is to pass our faith. Adam passed his faith to Enoch. Enoch passed his faith on to Noah. And Noah had a faith that saved humanity from extinction. So you start to realize just how important passing your faith on might be. So I think you and I are supposed to pass our faith on before we exit this world. And that means having a conversation with God that also leads others to have a conversation with God. And how does that happen? You got to run the race. You got to fight the good fight. You got to finish the course. Amen?